And as I said before, I will do the introduction in German because I think we will have some German-speaking people, and I think most of the people will know something about your CV anyhow because you're well known. But still, I will give some information about the lecture series and about tonight. I will switch between German and English, and if you have any questions, not only you, Robert, but also to the audience, don't hesitate, just write in the chat. So, welcome everybody. My name is Fabienne Décieux. I work at the Department of Sociology at the University of Vienna, and I'm a member of the board of the International Karl Polanyi Society, and I will guide you through the evening on the topic Karl Polanyis Relevance in the Contemporary Conjuncture of Contested Marketization with Robert Kuttner and Roland Atzmüller. Genau, die Veranstaltung ist ein Teil der Reihe Gegenbewegung. Diese Reihe wird von der WU Wien, der TU Wien, der Internationalen Karl Polanyi Society, der Johannes Kepler Universität Linz, der Gesellschaft für Kulturpolitik, GfK, dem Institut für angewandte Entwicklungspolitik und den beiden VHSen in Linz und in Wien in Kooperation mit der Arbeiterkammer Wien und Linz in diesem Wintersemester ausgerichtet. Und wir haben quasi diese Woche hier gestartet und haben quasi mit Robert Kuttner auch diese Lecture Series eröffnet, die sich mit dem Thema der Gegenbewegung in Anlehnung an Karl Polanyi als eines seiner Kernstücke auch in der Theorie auseinandersetzt. Das heißt, auch das Wintersemester steht ähnlich wie das vorherige Sommersemester unter den Vorzeichen von Polanyi, und wir werden nun Veranstaltungen quasi bis Ende Dezember haben. Was die kommende Woche erwartet, sage ich auch noch mal zum Ende der Veranstaltung. Genau, neu ist, dass das alles hybrid stattfindet. Also heute sind wir rein online. Unter normalen Umständen, wenn wir nicht Gäste aus den USA haben, wo die Einreise ja doch zuweilen noch sehr unsicher die ganze Zeit war, bis vor kurzem wegen Corona, haben wir sonst einen hybriden Status gewählt. Das heißt, Sie können alle bisherigen Veranstaltungen und auch die zukünftigen Veranstaltungen online streamen, live dabei sein, so wie heute, aber Sie können auch die Veranstaltungen, zum Beispiel die 2 Vorträge, die Robert Kuttner bereits gehalten hat, auf der Homepage der Volkshochschule Wien nachsehen, nicht lesen. Und zwar, wenn Sie Gegenbewegungen und VHS Wien googeln, finden Sie das sofort. Ich kann den Link leider nicht ganz auswendig, aber das schaffen Sie, glaube ich. Und hier können Sie quasi die interessanten Vorträge nachschauen und auch in die kommenden von der ganzen Welt aus begleiten. Gut, dann würde ich jetzt zum Ablauf ganz kurz was zum heutigen Abend und auch zum Ablauf des Abends sagen. Robert Kuttner wird uns im Rahmen seines Vortrages quasi seine Perspektiven auf Polanyi im Kontext der Marketization geben, und im Anschluss wird ihn Roland Atzmüller kommentieren. Bevor wir dann die Debatte auch für Sie, für das Publikum öffnen, hat Robert Kuttner nochmal die Möglichkeit, auf den Kommentar von Roland Atzmüller zu reagieren, direkt ad hoc. Sie selber, now I'm switching to English because I think this is relevant also for everybody if people don't understand any German. You all can ask questions after the lecture. Robert Kuttner will be commented by Roland Atzmüller, and then he can react ad hoc to Roland. And afterwards, we will open the floor for everybody, so you all can pose questions. I would ask you to write your question in the chat or to make a dot that you want to say something into the chat, and I will ask you to talk. Please be aware that the session will be recorded. So if you are going to talk, we will see your name, so it's not anonymous. If you want to change that, you can also change your name within Zoom. It's no problem, but we will publicate the recording afterwards, so be aware of it, please. If you don't want to be recognized, please change your name before posing the question. You can ask questions in German or in English. If you ask a question in German, I will translate it into English. And if so, I would prefer it if you write it to the chat, because then it's easier for me to handle it. Yes. So during the recording, during the session, we would ask you to mute yourself, but you all did it already, so perfect. And we all would ask you to not show us your video, but you're already doing that too, so perfect. So now I will give you some information on Robert Kuttner. Robert Kuttner hat eine Professur an der Heller School der Brandeis University. Die meiste Zeit seiner Karriere arbeitete er als Wirtschaftsjournalist. Kuttner ist Mitbegründer und Mitherausgeber des Magazins The American Prospect und war viele Jahre Kolumnist für die Business Week. Außerdem ist er Gründer des Economic Policy Institutes und gehört dessen Vorstand auch weiterhin an. Robert Kuttner ist Autor von 12 Büchern, darunter der New York Times Bestseller von 2008, Obama Challenge, America's Economic Crisis and the Power of the Transformative Presidency. Sein jüngstes Buch, The Stakes 2020 and the Survival of American Democracy, wurde 2019 veröffentlicht. Robert Kuttner arbeitete als Autor und Kolumnist für die Washington Post und war leitender Forscher des Banking-Komitees des US-Senates, Direktor der National Commission on Neighborhoods unter Präsident Carter und wirtschaftswissenschaftlicher Herausgeber von The New Republican. Als Wissenschaftler lehrte Kuttner an vielen Universitäten in den USA, unter anderem an der Boston University, aber beispielsweise auch in Harvard, was wir ja auch alle kennen. Seine Forschungsschwerpunkte liegen im Bereich der Auswirkungen der Globalisierung auf die Demokratie auf nationalstaatlicher Ebene und er forscht außerdem auch und setzt sich damit auseinander mit Möglichkeiten zu Alternativen zur gegenwärtigen Wirtschaftsstruktur, die zu einer größeren Einkommens-, Wohlstands- und auch Chancengleichheit führen und gleichzeitig die Demokratie stärken. Wir freuen uns schon sehr darauf, heute zu hören, was Robert Kuttner zu sagen hat. Ein bisschen kürzer. Der Beitrag wird auch mündlich wahrscheinlich ein bisschen kürzer sein. Noch Informationen zu Roland Atzmüller. Roland Atzmüller ist assoziierter Professor und stellvertretender Abteilungsleiter der Abteilung für Gesellschaftstheorie und Sozialanalysen an der Johannes Kepler Universität in Linz. Er ist Mitglied im Vorstand der International Karl Polanyi Society und auch Mitorganisator und Mitveranstalter dieser Reihe, deren Teil der heutige Vortrag auch sein wird. Seine Arbeitsschwerpunkte sind Kapitalismus und Gesellschaftstheorie, Wohlfahrtsstaatentheorie, Sozial- und Arbeitsmarktpolitik, Staatentheorien sowie Berufsbildungsforschung und Arbeitsforschung, und er forscht auch zur sozialen Ungleichheit. Seine jüngsten Publikationen sind unter anderem ein Artikel, den wir auch gemeinsam verfasst haben, wo quasi die Faschismustheorie von Polanyi Anwendung findet, nämlich The Origin of Our Time, Articulations between Neoliberal Social Policies, Reforms and the Shift to the Far Right through the Light of Polanyi's Theory of Fascism. Und dieser ist erschienen in Social Work and Society. Ein weiterer kürzlich erschienener Text von Roland Atzmüller, ein weiterer Aufsatz, ist die marxistische Theoriearbeit in der Krise. Dieser ist in der österreichischen Zeitschrift für Soziologie erschienen und außerdem ist Roland Atzmüller Mitherausgeber des Sammelbandes Transformation of Capitalism, wo sich verschiedenste Autorinnen und Autoren mit dem Werk von Polanyi aus verschiedenen Perspektiven auseinandersetzen und auch von ihm ein Beitrag eben auch mit der Perspektive auf die Faschismustheorie Polanyis und die Sozialpolitik veröffentlicht wurde. So viel quasi zu unseren Teilnehmerinnen heute, die zu uns sprechen werden. And now I would like to ask Robert Kuttner to talk to us. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I wish I were there in person. As you know, this was originally going to be a live series of lectures, and the pandemic intervened. And thanks also to the International Karl Polanyi Society, for sponsoring this. It is a pleasure to conclude this series of 4 lectures with one explicitly focusing on Karl Polanyi. By all rights, Polanyi should be the preeminently influential prophet of the fragilities of capitalism. Karl Marx, the other contender for that role, had a lot of good insights, made some small mistakes, and he made one big one. Marx thought that the dislocations and abuses of capitalism would end with the worldwide unity of workers. Polanyi, with the benefit of another 3/4 of a century of history, correctly discerned that the more likely consequence would be ultranationalism and fascism. Polanyi's historical analysis has now been grimly vindicated twice, first by the run-up to World War II, and now again by the resurrection of extreme economic liberalism and the reaction to it. And the consequences include the financial collapse of 2007 and 2008, the post-collapse enforcement of austerity to fulfill the imperatives of laissez-faire, a prolonged period of economic stagnation, the capture by financial elites of the political center and the prevailing narrative, and the all too predictable reaction in the alarming rise of neofascism, both in Europe and in the United States. Polanyi did not need this kind of vindication. It would have been far better if more people had heeded his warnings. When you consider the details of Polanyi's analysis, it becomes even more prophetic. Polanyi believed that the only way politically to temper the destructive influence of organized capital was to have highly sophisticated and highly mobilized worker movements, as he observed in Red Vienna in the 1920s. And for a time during the post-war era, we did have a mixed economy and a stabilized form of capitalism built on the strength of the social democratic state, underpinned by a strong labor movement. But since the era of Reagan and Thatcher and the revival of the power of financial capital, that countervailing power has been crushed with precisely the results that Polanyi would have predicted. We have a return to all of the pathologies that Polanyi described. Indeed, as I have described in the previous lectures in this series, hyperglobalization has intensified the rule of the market over the rule of democracy. It has weakened the state, weakened labor as a counterforce to capital, and it's weakened the credibility of the state and its capacity to deliver stability, prosperity, and dignity for ordinary people. The false prophets of the reign of the market, such as Mises and Hayek and Friedman, in a more extreme version of Adam Smith, claimed that political liberalism and economic liberalism went together. But as Polanyi foresaw, alienated and displaced people will reject political liberalism along with economic liberalism if fascism promises a return to stability and prosperity and self-respect. Fascism is comfortingly tribal. History has also shown, contrary to Hayek and Friedman, that capitalism and dictatorship can get along just fine. Russia operates a kind of klepto-capitalism in which oligarchs are tolerated as long as they are fully supportive of the regime. The Russian consumer economy is pathetic, but Russia is bailed out by its riches in energy resources. And China, as I described in yesterday's talk, is a successful case of a Leninist party supervising a kind of state capitalism in a bargain that is not supposed to work, but works all too well. Vietnam today is a successful capitalist economy which exploits its workers, led by a communist party. This inversion and confusion of categories and assumptions makes one head spin. Look at the political interventions sponsored by the US government around the world over the past several decades. Some of them were in response to genuine geopolitical threats, but others, as in Chile and elsewhere in Latin America, were aimed at helping US-based corporations and banks threatened by democratically elected left-wing governments. Market capitalism has often preferred to work with friendly dictators rather than unfriendly democratically elected governments and free labor movements. So much for Hayek and the supposed alliance of economic liberalism and political liberalism. Now, in all of this saga, I suppose maybe there's a kind of perverse good news. First of all, the claims of neoliberal ideology have now been demolished by reality. And today's neo-fascists are not really delivering for their people. Donald Trump delivered mainly the psychic gratification of white nationalism, but the actual economic benefits went to corporations. And though Trump tried to stage a coup to stay in office, he was not reelected. In Europe, it's just possible that the appeal of neo-fascism is beginning to peak. In the recent German elections, support for the AfD declined slightly. We just saw the neo-fascist right narrowly lose in the Czech Republic. The far right may have peaked in Austria. Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, despite something close to fascism, are not models of economic performance. Hitler, I am sorry to say, actually produced an economic recovery that benefited the working class, and he ran an effective welfare state. So today's neo-fascists, at least in terms of delivering economic benefits, are a pale imitation of the real thing. But that is small comfort, unless the Democratic left is proposing a convincing alternative that can both temper the excesses of free market capitalism and restore some hope to ordinary people. On Tuesday, I had a very interesting discussion with Eva Konset, and we discussed some rather good news. Until the climate crisis, the European Union has been mostly an engine of neoliberalism within Europe in its constitutional requirement for the free movement of capital, people, services, and goods. The EU, as a weak confederation, has not been able to agree on a lot of things, but it has been able to agree on austerity. There had been a fierce opposition to a debt union to help weaker economies. But lately, this has changed. And a key architect of the change was Olaf Scholz in his recent role as German finance minister. And of course, he's likely to be the next chancellor. The EU now has green bonds to finance an energy transition. This certainly sounds like a debt union. It also has a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a euphemism for a green tariff. All of this is surely post-neoliberal. It countermands market pricing, and Europe, for a welcome change, is leading. So if we ask the question, where will the contestation of excessive marketization come from? Here is one place. For there is no case of market failure as grave as climate change. As I have discussed in Monday's and Tuesday's lecture, it's also coming from Joe Biden. Biden, to the surprise of many Americans, is really casting his administration in the mold of Franklin Roosevelt. So we have won the argument, but we have not yet won the politics, and we have not yet won the institutions. And that's the great challenge. So let me return to the lessons of Polanyi's teachings. In his masterwork, The Great Transformation, Polanyi emphasized that the core imperatives of classical 19th century liberalism were first, free trade, secondly, the idea that labor had to find its price on the market, and third, the enforcement of the gold standard. Well, have things changed? Not really. We just have more modern counterparts. Until recently, we've had an ever more intensive push for free trade, the better to destroy the remnants of managed capitalism and the welfare state. We have had deregulation of what remains of labor market safeguards, the better to increase profits for multinational corporations. And in place of the gold standard, whose 19th century role was to force nations to put sound money and the interests of bondholders ahead of real economic performance, we have the euro and the Central European Bank and the austerity policies enforced by the EC, the IMF, and until recently, Chancellor Merkel. This, mercifully, has also begun to change for the better as democratically elected leaders get serious about contesting extreme marketization. The euro has forced 18 nations to lock currency parities, much as the gold standard once locked exchange rates by tying them to the price of gold. And with financial deregulation and the resurrection of the bond market as the overseer and the ECB as the bond market's enforcer, we now have had the EU enforcing penalties against nations that had the effrontery to run deficits during recessions. Germany in the early 1920s was destroyed by reparations. Greece has had to pay the equivalent of reparations to the bond market. And so this unholy trinity of economic policies that Polanyi identified as the core of classical liberalism failed in the years before and after 2008, just as it did in the 1920s. The policies are practical failures as economics, as politics, and as social policy. We should not have to learn the lesson yet again. Surely it is time for the rediscovery of Polanyi. And though The Great Transformation was the book that would not quite die, for the most part, Polanyi is loved by people such as ourselves who have found our way to his work, but he is not quite a celebrity public intellectual. He's not the kind of scholar who is assigned to students in order to make sure that they are educated adults. Why not? Well, consider first what we might call the demand side. Which forces in a capitalist economy prize which intellectuals and for what purpose? If you look at things from that perspective, you can understand why the orthodox narrative has been dominated by the likes of Hayek and Friedman, the rational expectations theorists, the cost-benefit quantifiers, the promoters of the theory of efficient markets and maximizing shareholder value and hyperglobalization. Despite the wide variety of plumage and all the algebra, basically all these people have two things in common. First, their theories add up to the counsel that governments and democracies should leave corporations and owners of wealth alone. And secondly, just about everything they wrote has been contradicted by events. Markets are not self-regulating, nor do they price things accurately. Witness global climate change and the financial collapse. The price of labor does not reflect its marginal productivity, but is deeply contoured by the relative balance of power between workers and corporations. Public spending in a period of depressed demand is not inflationary, but it's necessary to prevent depression, and so on. But these mistaken theories and theorists remain highly congenial and convenient to economic elites, so the theories persist despite their plain unreality, while our cherished Karl Polanyi does not have the influence that he deserves. Polanyi did battle with Hayek and won the argument, but Hayek had more influence on events and on prevailing views. You can see the origins of how this works by going back to the Privat seminar in Vienna run by Mises and his protege, Hayek. As Kari Polanyi-Levitt explains in her most recent work, From the Great Transformation to the Great Financialization, Mises, with no academic position, conducted this influential seminar from his post as secretary of the Austrian Chamber of Commerce. The seminar became a center of the ultra laissez-faire Austrian School of Economics, and Hayek was Mises' prime student. The Austrian Chamber of Commerce underwrote and incubated the latest twist on classical liberalism. And Mises, as a laissez-faire theorist, influenced and subsidized by organized finance, anticipated and influenced the neoliberalism of Thatcher, Reagan, Clinton, and Schroeder by 3/4 of a century. As early as 1920, Polanyi was challenging the Mises-Hayek view. Polanyi lambasted Hayek and Mises both for commending the conditions that led to fascism and even for apologizing for fascism interference with the market. Even apologizing for fascism's discipline of popular democracies' interference with the market. The fascist solution to the impasse of liberal capitalism, Polanyi wrote, can be described as reform of the market economy achieved at the price of extirpation of all democratic institutions. He was prophetic. But what happened? Hayek ends up at the London School of Economics, of all places. The Austrian school gets dignified by being considered a formal school of libertarian economics. And Hayek later wins the Nobel Prize in economic science. Meanwhile, Polanyi has to write his work as a visiting lecturer at Bennington College after having been a visiting lecturer in a worker extension program at Oxford. And finally, in his 7th decade, he's offered a real job in an economics department at Columbia. But he cannot remain in the US because his wife, who had been underground in the 1930s and was a communist, was denied a visa to the United States as a security risk. In Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, within months of the publication of The Great Transformation, Hayek famously contended that even social democratic forms of state intervention were bound to end in the totalitarianism of a Stalin or a Hitler. But 80 years later, there is not a single case of social democracy leading to dictatorship, but there are countless tragic episodes of market turbulence overwhelming democracy and leading to fascism, just as Polanyi warned. Polanyi surely had the better of the argument, but Hayek, whose book became a bestseller and was condensed in the Reader's Digest in 1944 and 45, meanwhile, Polanyi's book sold just 1,701 copies. And in researching an article about Polanyi, I was intrigued to learn about just how Hayek's book became a bestseller and Polanyi's book did not. When The Great Transformation was published, the New York Times assigned the review to someone named John Chamberlain, and the review was savage. Chamberlain wrote, "This beautifully written essay in the reevaluation of 150 years of history adds up to a subtle appeal for a new feudalism, a new slavery, a new status of economy that will tie men to their places of abode and their jobs." And if that sounds curiously like Hayek, it was for good reason. Chamberlain had just written the introduction to The Road to Serfdom, and Chamberlain was one of Hayek's chief promoters. So the supposed free marketplace of ideas is one more market that doesn't work like the model. There is an invisible thumb on the scale of free discourse. And when economic liberalism came roaring back under Reagan and Thatcher, it was Hayek who was among the key sources of inspiration. As John Ranley tells the story in his book on the Rise of Thatcher, the Institute of Economic Affairs had arranged a meeting between Hayek and Thatcher in London soon after Thatcher was elected leader of the Conservative Party in February of 1975. During Thatcher's only visit to the party's research department in the summer of 1975, a speaker had prepared a paper on why the path that the Conservative Party should take should be influenced by Hayek. And before he had finished, Thatcher reached into her briefcase and took out a book. It was Hayek's book, The Constitution of Liberty. And interrupting the speaker, she held up the book for all to see. "This," she said, "is what we believe," and she banged the Hayek book down on the table. Thatcher was a forceful personality, as was her contemporary and counterpart, Ronald Reagan. But Thatcher and Reagan, beyond their personalities, represented deep structural forces in the influence of organized finance regaining its usual power as the elements of the post-war compromise unraveled. Thus ended the first Polanyi moment. Was this inevitable? In 1939, an enthusiast of a federated Europe wrote that with European federation, quote, "certain economic powers which are now generally wielded by the national state could be exercised neither by the federation nor by the state." The author was Friedrich Hayek. It was the truest thing Hayek ever said, and maybe the only true thing. A weak state serves the libertarian purpose. Now, A second main reason why Polanyi doesn't have the influence that he should have, that he has so clearly earned, has to do with the logic of academic disciplines. Polanyi was really more of a journalist and a polemicist and a self-taught economic historian than a real academic. And this means that no academic discipline quite can claim him, although economic sociology has made an effort. And that he had few graduate students, and that his followers come from diverse disciplines. And the fact that he wrote in English meant that he is not nearly as familiar to the German-speaking world as he deserves to be. So, in one sense, the interdisciplinary appeal is good, but it's not so good in the sense that he doesn't quite get claimed by any academic discipline, and so his work is not really assigned in the standard courses in economics or political science or sociology or even history. And I guess in addition to being drawn to his understanding of history and his analysis, as someone who is myself more a journalist and an editor and an agitator than a true academic, I recognize the type and I prize Polanyi as a member of a familiar tribe. Like many of you, I stumbled on Polanyi fortuitously. When I was an undergraduate at Oberlin College, one of my teachers was a man named George Lanyi, who was a Hungarian emigre whose own teacher was the great Oscar Yassi, who was Polanyi's close colleague and mentor. And later, when I began studying political economy, international political economy, I stumbled on John Gerard Ruggi's now classic 1982 essay on embedded liberalism with the salute to Polanyi, and I began reading Polanyi with new appreciation. Now, if you trace Polanyi's influence, it doesn't really work to look up citations the way you would do with most academics. You have to really look at whose work Polanyi influenced. And this is very interesting. There are some people who don't seem natural Polanyans who are influenced by Polanyi. There are other people who think very much like Polanyi who never even cite him and maybe have not even read him. And you can begin with people who were Polanyans before Polanyi. That list has to begin with a man named Thorstein Veblen, who was a wonderful heterodox, self-taught American economist who wrote long before the Great Transformation that a system dominated by a self-adjusting market, quote, could not exist for any length of time without annihilating the human and natural substance of society. And Veblen went on to write, if every economic transaction were subject to perpetual, rationalized, calculating revision, as market theory commands, it is not conceivable that the institutional fabric could last overnight. Now, Polanyi's biographer, Gareth Dale, believes that Polanyi did, in fact, read Veblen and was influenced by the tradition of American institutionalism. And if you look at American social scientists and other social scientists of the first rank, including sociologists and historians and political scientists, you can find several like Daniel Bell or Ira Katznelson or Jacob Hacker, or economists like Joseph Stiglitz and Danny Roderick and Herman Daly, who explicitly credit Polanyi. But oddly, you can find others like John Kenneth Galbraith, who seem to be working very much in the Polanyi tradition, or Michael Walzer, who never credit him, and it's not even clear that they ever read him. So this is the price that you pay in the word of another great heterodox Middle European thinker, Albert Hirschman. This is the price you pay for being a trespasser across disciplines and for not being credentialed in any discipline. It's also interesting that a number of conservatives have found their way to Polanyi because conservatives writing in the tradition of the British conservative Edmund Burke worry about the destructive influence of the market on the social fabric. And there are several Burkean conservatives, such as John Gray, a kind of recovering Thatcherite, and the anthropologist James Scott, who really acknowledged their debt to Polanyi. To read people's work that crosses disciplines is one of the intellectual joys of my life, and I suspect that's why so many of us are drawn to Polanyi. It's not just the aptness and the brilliance of the critique, but it's the synthesis and the crossing of disciplinary silos. We cherish Polanyi as broad spectrum intellectuals and as educated citizens, not as narrow disciplinarians. And let me come back in that sense to Polanyi and Marx. I certainly consider myself more of a Polanyian than a Marxist. And yet the world today looks rather more Marxist than it did in the 1960s when I first read Polanyi. At the apex of the post-war boom in the United States and in Europe, Marx's prediction of capitalist self-destruction seemed almost silly. A contented bourgeoisie was huge and growing. The proletariat enjoyed steady income gains thanks to strong unions and strong public regulation. The political energy of aroused workers that Marx imagined as revolutionary instead went to support social democratic and progressive parliamentary parties. These built a welfare state to housebreak capitalism, but not overturn it. And nations that celebrated Marx, meanwhile, were bleak economic failures that repressed their own working classes. Half a century later, the middle class is beleaguered and insecure. A global reserve army of the unemployed batters down wages and marginalizes labor's political power. Even elite professions are becoming proletarianized, and a lumpenproletariat of homeless vagrants and stateless migrants rends the social fabric. The globalized market weakens the reach of the democratic state, undermining the protections of the mixed economy and reinforcing neoliberalism. And with finance still supreme, despite the disgrace of the 2008 collapse, and Goldman Sachs having provided 5 of the 6 Treasury Secretaries of the United States, it's no longer laughable to use capital in Marx's sense as a collective noun. The state is not quite the executive committee of the ruling class, but it's not far from it. And though some Marxists share some of their analysis with Polanyi, I do consider Polanyi a much better guide to the dynamics of capitalism than Marx. Marx trafficked in iron laws. Polanyi spoke more about propensities and predispositions. And that comports much better, I think, with my own sense of history. Polanyi believed, hopefully, in the power of human agency. And neo-Marxism, because of its formalism, is more of a discipline than Polanyism. Marxism has its journals, its professors, and a few heterodox departments, its graduate students. And so Marxism, oddly, has more systematic influence in academia, whereas we Polanyians are freer spirits. And I think we should beware of a tendency, I want to pick my words carefully here, to a kind of neo-scholasticism or a formalism that some people who invoke Polanyi would like to practice. Polanyi, above all, was a free spirit, and trying to reduce him to a kind of formalism violates the whole spirit of his inquiry. Last, the reason we cherish Polanyi beyond the brilliance of his insight is that he gave us a sense of hope. Though wealth tends to concentrate, and though concentrated wealth tends to produce concentrated political power, history displays exceptions, like Red Vienna in the 1920s, like the post-war boom in the United States and Europe, like the era of Franklin Roosevelt, like the effort by Joe Biden to reinvent the New Deal. And so, besides being the great analyst of capitalism and society, Polanyi was the prophet of learning from history, not repeating history's mistakes. And in today's political economy, we need not just the wisdom, but the hopefulness of Polanyi more than ever. thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. And I would ask Roland to comment on it before we are opening the floor.
So thank you, Robert, for this very interesting and thought-provoking talk. And there are many points I can quite agree to what you were saying. There's one thing about which I will start, because you mentioned this interdisciplinary character, and I'm much less of an economist and much more a social scientist. And as being a social scientist, one of the ideas of Karl Polanyi referring to fictitious commodities was very important in many aspects. For example, if it comes to the analysis of social policies, for which it was a very crucial influence, his idea of labor being a fictitious commodity under capitalism, and asking the question how labor is commodified, is becoming a commodity, what this demands, even though it is not produced for the market and it cannot solely be reproduced through the market, as it needs reproductory work, for example. So the idea of decommodification, for example, was a very major foundation and base for welfare state debates. And the idea of commodification, decommodification of fictitious commodities is certainly something, if you talk about nature, for example, which you also covered through the concept of land, for example, very important to understand what's going on today. That is one point to expand and build on your thoughts, and to refer to the scope of the Polanyan thinking. Nevertheless, there's a few comments I would like to make, because maybe I'm not that optimistic in some respects as to the things you said, and this might be a more European perspective, I don't know. First, I'm not that optimistic about the recent attempts of the European Union to implement the Green Deal, for example. So the left-wing Euro Memo group, for example, is a group of left-wing economists working all over Europe, publishing a memorandum every year. They point out, in relation to the European Green Deal in 2020, I quote, "The EGD is essentially a green growth approach. It does not involve the substantial socio-ecological transformation needed to address fundamental ecological and social crises. There's a heavy emphasis on market mechanisms, on the single market, while norms such as solidarity and alternative forms of economic organization hardly appear, if at all. The just transition mechanism is not sufficiently funded. Socio-ecological objectives are essentially subordinated to fiscal nostrums." So basically they say it's too less, and the form how it is done via market that will just build on the existing logic. And so I wonder whether, and now I'm applying some more Marxist idea, whether the European states and the European Union, being some kind of a state form already, is basically taking its role as a capitalist in general and changing the general conditions for the expanded reproduction of capital, when they use this term, by bringing forward some more ecological issues, maybe, and securing this. And from the perspective of criticizing neoliberalism, from a more European and even German-speaking perspective, a strong role of the state should not be that referring to a necessary change to something which is more progressive, because ordoliberalism, the German-speaking tradition, has always relied on a strong state. So this is not something where I would be that optimistic. And also, if it comes to Olaf Scholz, even though I will prefer the incoming government far more than a former dominated government, but the experience with Olaf Scholz, and he was a key architect of the Hartz IV reforms in Germany, which basically did nothing more than did bring about the commodification of labor, created one of the biggest low-wage labor markets in Europe. So I'm not very optimistic about that, even though, as I said, I will prefer to other government options. So this is the first thing. The second thing, I'm also not that optimistic about the peaking and even maybe waning of what you call Neofascism, and I would agree that many aspects of this emergence of the new right is neo-fascist, but I would rather like to apply a broader term, because I think we should also be able to include not those governments which are having clear fascist leanings, but also governments like maybe the Trump administrations, maybe the the Boris Johnson administration in the UK, which all represent right-wing populist far-right developments. And I think at least some of them are economically not that unsuccessful. So Poland has high growth rates, for example. I looked it up. And so obviously there is something they can deliver for their constituencies. This in some cases, it might not be like the workers in the US who some of them at least hoped for some things the Trump administration might bring them. But evidently the changing of, like, for example, social policies they're bringing about, who are clearly aimed at supporting a nationalized understanding of recipients at the expense of a racialized underclass, for example, which certainly brings different benefits. So I think, so for example, if like the Trump administration, when you really confront the Black Lives Matter movements and other attempts to improve the situation of the Black and people of color population in the US vis-a-vis the state, vis-a-vis the economy, you not only have some psychological gratification, but that's economic. You create an underclass which delivers cheap labor in the service sector, which basically keeps the reproduction costs of the middle class low, so they might accept a marketized economy. I think it was very similar in Germany, creating a labor low-wage working class, and so you can have wage moderation for export-oriented model, basically. It's very simplified, I agree, but basically it stabilized this model. And this, of course, led to the instabilities of the European Union that have emerged from that. So I doubt that the far-right movements will be stalled for a long time, and they might maybe come back more radicalized. And this brings me to my last comment. I think it's really interesting to look at the Polanyian theories of fascism, or theory of fascism. He developed mainly in his papers of the 1930s, as you certainly know, and he applies it much less in the Great Transformation. And because there he well, I have to go first to ask the question whether we can really interpret Polanyi as like presenting the upsurge of fascism and this kind of pendulum between market expansion and embedding of the economy as a kind of moving to and fro, so that if there's too much marketization, fascism might occur, and whether it's not also a process where questions about the social embedding of the economy are emerging. Because if you take the Polanyian considerations, so he showed, his argument in the 1930s was that on the one hand, there was an economic crisis emerging from the marketized economy, of course, and the instabilities. But on the other hand, he was also showing that fascism, and you mentioned that, was attacking democracy. It was geared against, and he debated it in debating an Austrian philosopher like Atzmüller, for example. He was debating that. So he was analyzing this position of this philosopher as this one pointed out that there was that the modern developments brought forward by the counter movement, such as socialism, whatever, had brought forward universal equality, individual freedom, and democracy as the kind of counter movement. And this created a tension, a crisis, and fascism was there for him, not a counter movement, but a reaction to marketization, basically by destroying democracy, abandoning individual freedoms, and creating a racialized society of inequalities among races, and so on. And I think this is very interesting because the culture wars the far right is now leading, and you know that from the US. They're basically doing a similar thing. They're just claiming that the crisis is not just because of the economy, but it's because there are the effects of ongoing struggles about emancipation, the gender relations, in anti-racist struggles, LGBTQ, whatever. And this is, I think, these things I think belong together, and this is the reason why I think that the far right is that successful, because it is able to combine these two developments to their view of how to answer and how to react to the ongoing problems of societies, and in particular in relation to, and later maybe to climate warming. Yeah, thank you. So that's basically a range of my thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roland. Do you want to answer or to comment on the comment, Robert?
No, I thought that was very helpful and instructive. Let me just say, I don't want to place too much stock in the European Green Deal. I just think it is progress to see something that begins to approach the idea of a common debt instrument, which had been completely verboten even as a concept until very recently. So I take progress where I can find it. I don't mean to be unrealistically optimistic, and maybe temperamentally I'm a little more optimistic because I look at moments in history where for a while anyway, like Red Vienna, like the Roosevelt era in the United States, the reaction to excessive commodification of everything is a kind of democratic socialism, is a kind of empowerment of working people and the building of collective institutions and the decommodification. It tends not to last long enough. And so that's ground for pessimism. But I'm very much of a Gramscian in that respect, pessimism of the mind, optimism of the will. You have to be a pessimist based on what you know. You have to be an optimist based on your hopes.
Okay, no, I have no problem about that.
So thank you very much. I would open the floor for questions. If you want to post a question, you can write it into the chat, or you can use the raising hand, and I will ask you to talk or read your question out loud. Okay. Phoebe, I think you are just clapping right now. I hope I understood right. If you want to talk, you have to give me a hint again. So, okay, if you want to ask
just a few.
Go ahead.
I would just like to ask if you've done also something like looking at Polanyi parallel to the work of Theda Skocpol and Barrington Moore, the structure of society and the revolutionary process, and how they look at this and what's the difference between them. Because we look at in the third world, and from the Philippines, by the way, from the University of the Philippines, Polanyi is a very good is very good material, like the Great Transformation, to help us understand balance of power, the self-regulating market, the liberal state, or the international gold standard, if we go back to the historical development. But I could also see that his work is more parallel to that of Theda Skocpol and Barrington Moore. But what's the opinion of the speaker?
Well, I have learned, I read Barrington Moore a long time ago. I learned a lot from reading Barrington Moore. I learned a huge amount from reading Theda Skocpol. She's written a vast number of books. Which aspect of Skocpol's work, I mean, I know it pretty well, but which aspect of Skocpol's research or insights are you referring to that you say?
State and revolution.
Yeah. I mean, I think Skocpol would certainly consider herself a Polanyian, and she's brilliant. And the whole question of how institutions of democratic representation of ordinary working people prosper or do not prosper is at the absolute center of her research project. So I do think there's a parallel there.
Okay.
I don't think on short notice I could give you a competent disquisition on Barrington Moore, Theda Skocpol, and Polanyi.
Yeah.
But
Barrington Moore.
I do recognize
yeah.
the overlap and the affinity. So thank you for mentioning them.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I see another question, Patrick Clark.
Hi, Robert and others. That was a very enjoyable talk. I wasn't able to participate in any of the other ones this week, but I'm glad that I caught this. And I guess one thing I've been thinking a lot about recently, kind of in teaching Polanyi and teaching, Marx Polanyi in courses to undergrads, trying to like explain the differences. Just this question of values, right? Like Polanyi has sort of a vision of a different society, and maybe Marxism doesn't really have that theory of ethics, right? This is sort of why I'm more of a Polanyyan than a Marxist. And it seems like today we are in this period of a real kind of secular, just kind of a secular stagnation. Like I was teaching Rostow and Polanyi and kind of juxtaposing Rostow, Polanyi, Marx, and this idea of the sort of professional managerial class, or what Piketty in his book is called the Brahmin left. I wonder what you think Polanyi would have to say about that, and what that has to do with this kind of, revival of kind of a labor politics, or more of a materialist kind of politics, that in this age that is kind of post-materialist in some ways, where we have post-materialist values. Like, what would Polanyi say about this? Because I think it's a real challenge in terms of coming up with a kind of democratic workerist politics where we can have common representation. Like Polanyi is definitely for a kind of cross-class coalition, but I think that more and more this is a real challenge, and not just in the sort of global north, but also global south societies, right? Like it's this kind of division that's happening in societies. I think he would have some interesting things to say, but I'm curious to hear what you think. It's sort of something I've been thinking about and reflecting on. Yeah. Thank you.
It's a great comment. Thank you for that. Where are you teaching these undergraduates, by the way? Where do you teach?
At York University in Toronto. Yeah.
So, one doesn't want to put words in Polanyi's mouth. So if one can presume to kind of invoke a sort of Polanyian sensibility and apply it to what has happened to institutions of working class representation and the downward mobility without a political consciousness. You wouldn't exactly call it a lumpen proletariat, but Uber drivers or other workers who are really getting screwed by the terms of the economy, but who don't particularly have a working class consciousness, don't have a class consciousness at all, have internalized the values of the market. It's just me versus the market and however much money I can make. And there is not much solidarity. And it's really the antithesis of Red Vienna. It's atomization. I suppose a Marxist would say it's false consciousness, but it's the decay of working class institutions. And we've seen it all over the West, trade union representations getting weaker and weaker and weaker. Meanwhile, this is the other bizarre inversion. The people who support left parties are cosmopolitan, bien-pensant, who are for the environment and LGBT rights and animal rights. And, so the Hillary Clinton got beat in 2016 because she didn't give a damn about workers. And this was all about all of the other politically correct stuff that all of my friends are in favor of. So, if you go back to the New Deal, very different kind of class politics. New Deal is working class people and trade unionists and liberal educated intellectuals. Somehow something has gone wrong with that coalition. And the working class people are disproportionately voting for Trump. And if you go to an affluent neighborhood, the guy who is delivering pizza is likely to be voting for Trump, and the person who's receiving the pizza is likely to be voting for the left-wing Democrat. So this has gotten completely messed up. And I think the challenge is to put together that coalition by having well-thinking liberal intellectuals of the professional class paying more attention to what is really doing in the working class, and to reconstruct trade unions and reconstruct post-trade union institutions of worker representation. Because you go back to Polanyi's early work on Red Vienna in the 20s, he understood that above anything else, if you were going to practically contest the influence of ultra-marketization, you needed worker institutions as the absolute backbone of that political project. That's what we've lost. That's what we need to have to get back.
Are there further questions, or do you want to comment on anything too, Roland, of the questions?
Maybe a short comment, because I'm not quite glad about this, how the success of far-right parties is presented, because the working class in the US is also black and it's Hispanic, and they did not vote for Trump. So basically, there's a cleavage going through the working class, and I think the main thing in the US is that they're not voting at all, that they're not. So I agree to you that the institutions are missing, and we see that in many countries. When we look at the participation in the election process, there's a far higher propensity not to participate in the lower classes than in the middle classes. So they're basically demobilized before they vote for fascism. And I'm saying that because I think this is a very problematic debate when it runs into the argument like that the questions about anti-racism or something are only for the middle class topic. I think that we should. We're not quite clear about that, because the class composition has changed in the migration societies.
Well, let me just respond to that. So much of what afflicts class coalition politics in the United States goes back to slavery. And, you know, we've never had socialism in the United States. Our politics are more right-wing than they are in the rest of the West, because the potential cross-racial class coalition has never come together, and it's never come together because it's easy for demagogues, and this goes back long before Trump, to frighten white working class people that if you're not careful, you could be just as bad off as black people. And so you may be being exploited in 100 different ways, but at least you're better than black people. And this has been the politics going back centuries. And this is still the politics in the white South. So yes, working class Hispanic people are more likely to vote for Democrats, although that's true in California, not true in Florida because of the Cuban influence. It's complicated. And as you indicated, Roland, the militance of Black Lives Matter, which is legitimate and justified, is used by the Trump people to frighten the white working class. So in addition to the project of reviving institutions of working class representation, like trade unions or other institutions, on top of that, we have to work even harder to have cross-racial alliances at a time when people like Trump use race to divide the working class, or not just the working class, but the downwardly mobile middle class. And there was a very interesting report that was put out about 2 weeks ago called Factory Towns. And it demonstrated that the most dramatic gravitation of working class people from the Democratic Party to the Trump Party occurred in cities that had lost factories, not surprisingly. And this is another price of global marketization. If you have hyper-marketization, then those jobs go to China, and the market conception of efficiency says everybody gains. And of course, the backbone of the trade union movement, which historically was the backbone of the Democratic Party, loses. And this is also going on all over the West, and it's another consequence of ultra-marketization.
Are there any other questions, any further questions from the audience or comments? If not yet, I would ask a question. So you explained to us pretty vividly why Polanyi isn't as well known as Hayek or Mises or compared economics. And one thesis you told us is that reason is because he's interdisciplinary. He's not really like an economist, not really a sociologist. And the question I ask myself is that really an explanation, or shouldn't he be even more famous due to that fact? Because he's interesting for economists, he's interesting for sociologists, he's also interesting for political science, I might guess. He's interesting for social movement studies and so forth and so forth. And wouldn't that also be a potential? And aren't there any other factors? Like you told us, for example, of the review in the Times and stuff like that. I think, yeah, perhaps you can comment on that a little bit further.
Academia has become so balkanized and so scholasticized, if that's a word. So if you are someone who works within the confines of a discipline, you publish in journals, you have graduate students, you have citations, you have a whole machine, as it were, publicizing your work within the discipline, and you become a figure of importance within the discipline. And I think people who are interdisciplinary pay a price. First of all, they're criticized within the discipline as mere popularizers. Galbraith, who was a genius, who was a fine technical economist, but he had to contend with this all of his professional life. He's a mere popularizer. Keynes never got a chair at Cambridge. The most he ever got, he was a lecturer. And yes, there is a Keynesian school, but the Keynesian school mostly distorts what Keynes actually taught. And Albert Hirschman, who's one of my favorites, who described himself as a trespasser, was trained as an economist, but worked really as a moral philosopher. He worked in economic development. He worked in economic history. He more than anything else, he was a philosopher. And the price you pay for crossing boundaries of disciplines is that no discipline claims you, and you tend not to have a lot of graduate students, and you tend not to have a formal school. And so what happens after you're dead is that people stumble on your work and say, wow, that's interesting. How come I didn't get to read that when I was studying sociology or history? But, and then maybe somebody founds a society in your honor. Maybe in 50 years, there'll be a Kuttner society, who knows? But I'm saying during one's lifetime, one pays a price. And Polanyi was a free spirit. I mean, if you look at what he did after he wrote The Great Transformation, he lived another 20 years. He got interested in primitive economies. He got interested in, he just followed his nose. He followed his intellectual curiosity. And that's also out of keeping with the norms of kind of sticking to a discipline. And the consequence of this is that academics whose work is very boring and very narrow and doesn't lead to new insights become much more influential in their fields than original thinkers like Polanyi. Now, let me say, and I want to tread very carefully here because I don't know who I'm offending, within the field of Polanyans, ever since Mark Granovetter wrote about embeddedness, there is a tendency within the field of Polanyi studies to reduce Polanyi to a kind of formalism, to a kind of scholasticism. Well, what do we mean by embeddedness? And then you have embeddedness studies. To me, that's just boring. It's out of keeping with the kind of large protean intellectual who Polanyi was. But that is a reflection of what it takes to try and have influence and create a discipline, right? And the fact that Polanyi was just too big a thinker, too original a thinker to stay within the bounds of a discipline, that cost him. But I also think the demand side of the story is really crucial. There was a demand on the part of, if you will, financial capital, or if you want to speak Marxian, the ruling class or political elites, for thinkers who validated their view of the world. And they throw money at think tanks and research institutions to teach the value of neoliberalism. Whereas we who founded the Economic Policy Institute as a labor-oriented think tank, we're going around with a begging cup trying to get some money from foundations because there's no demand for this. Why would corporate elites want to finance a social democratic think tank? Why would you do that? So I think both factors apply when you try to understand why Polanyi doesn't have more influence either in the world or in the academy or among students than more conventional academics, even Marxist academics who have their own tribe, which is a much better organized tribe than this heterodox Polanyian view.
So I have another question, Andreas.
Does it work? Do you hear me?
Hello, Andreas.
Yes.
Hello. Hello, Bob. Long time no see. Nearly 24 hours. Yeah, I have a question. I think the interest in Polanyi, the increasing in recent times is strongly linked to the ecological question, which we discussed very little over these 4 days. And I totally agree on this issue of how and that's very Polanyian, that we have to reflect on why the left is no longer a workers' movement, and that's really a problem. But I think the ecological question poses a challenge to the left in general, because in my reading, Polanyi, a little bit like Walter Benjamin and others, was one of the first left thinkers who was aware that being left does not always mean being in favor of progress. And I think the critique of progress in different aspects is one of the strengths, or one of the reasons why there is an interest in Polanyi, because his concept of habitation and this dialectics of improvement and habitation directs attention to the fact that being left means being in favor of progress sometimes, but it might also be being in favor of conserving and defending certain modes of living, certain traditions, or certain ecological habitats. And in this sense, I think he is a thinker of the 21st century, and it helps in doing politics. I would be leaning to the to an understanding of Polanyi that his concepts also being highly intuitive and very helpful. They don't have the rigor of Marx, but I think it has it really helps of enlarging political economy to cultural and ecological concerns, and that's one of his key strengths.
I could not agree more. I could not agree more. That's very well put. And I think the tension, by the way, around environmental issues and climate issues. I mean, Roland talked about Hartz IV. How do you tell working people who have just been completely screwed by the Social Democratic Party that, oh, by the way, now you have to reduce your living standards even further for the sake of the environment? How do you do that? And it's too easy to dismiss green growth as just another kind of growth, but somehow the ecological left has to have a story for working class people that talks about preserving what they care about in a way that doesn't feel like a further deterioration of their living standards, of their livelihood, of their dignity. And yes, it may be less materialistic in the sense of taking less of a toll on the planet. But I think post-materialism is a luxury for the cultural left, that is never going to be sold to the working class. What will work maybe with the working class is a completely different kind of living well, of living securely, that takes less of a toll on the planet. That maybe if you have electricity from different sources, it will ultimately be more reliable and it will be cheaper. And but I've had these arguments with my post-materialist friends, and I say to them, try making that argument in a union hall. Good luck. You will be thrown out. And somehow these two wings of the left absolutely have to get together. And yes, Polanyi had that sensibility. His interest in so-called primitive economies that cared about the earth and the society and the well-being of the collectivity. I mean, he was way ahead of his time, and he is very much a figure for our time.
May I?
Please.
Yeah. What we are discussing in Polanyi society and other places is, in my understanding, one of the potentials of linking these material concerns with the ecological restrictions is extending social ecological infrastructures, aiming at a strengthening collective consumption, be it public transport, being public leisure facilities, being increasing care infrastructures. All these are types of infrastructure that are much less resource intensive, and which, on the other hand, would imply certain limits and reductions of consumption in other areas, but it's really an attempt, and social democracy in Red Vienna at its best was a social infrastructure project with a clear ecological implication. And I think this is one way forward of combining the two. And by the way, linking it to the cultural issue, it has the tendency that even Republicans and Democrats might appreciate green areas. So it might help of how have you called it, de-tribalize politics.
Well, you know, my first two lectures were about Biden. One of the best things that Biden has done, he is proposing to spend trillions of dollars on social infrastructure, caring infrastructure, which is probably the single most radical thing about his program, which does have this potential to take the emphasis off of material consumption and put it more on collective consumption and improve the wages and the salaries paid to the caring workforce. So by American standards, this is quite radical, and at the risk of sounding optimistic, quite hopeful.
So if there aren't any further questions now, or are there any further questions? I can't see any hands and nothing in the chat. I would like to say thank you again to Robert Kuttner, especially. It was really interesting. It was a pleasure to have you, although it's only virtual. It would be much nicer if you could have been in Austria, but we take what we get during the pandemic and during Corona. So during COVID, so thank you very much. And it was nice to have Roland for the comments, and also thank you to him and the audience for the questions. I will send the link to the homepage I told you before in the chat. So if you want to have a look at the lectures of Robert Kuttner or the upcoming dates, if you want to have a look, you can click on the link, and I will also send you the link to the International Karl Polanyi Society if you are interested in upcoming events or anything else on Polanyi in this context. You will find it there. Yes. So next week we will meet really in a hybrid modus again in Linz. and you're really welcome. We will discuss in German with Klaus Dörre, Hans-Jürgen Urban, and Barbara Plaha, and I will be there again too on the stage. And we will talk about Mosaiklinke, demokratische Klassenpolitik, Agenda für dich und mich, Reform oder Transformation des Kapitalismus. So we will have a look at potentials of transformation of capitalism. Yes, so thank you very much. And I wish you a nice evening or a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for all these lectures.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Fabienne.
Bye.
And Bob, let's talk next week.
Yeah.
Beginning next week.
Yeah.
Have a few days of relaxing. Yeah.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
All the best.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Ciao, ciao.